you're right, though. I think there's a difference between technology and lining up a device from a tech and spec feature and design. I mean, at the end of the day, people make a choice based on design. And at the time, Apple had really slick, sexy-looking devices, and people would line up to buy them. And the other thing that is really important is the user interface was really, really simple. It was so easy to get a brand new iPhone and be able to operate it that there was no real learning curve. You didn't have to be a Symbian user or a Windows Phone user for years to understand exactly all the tips and tricks.
You're listening to Words of Mass Disruption with Eric Haynes.
Welcome to another episode of Words of Mass Disruption. I'm your host, Eric Haynes, and thank you for joining us for another deep dive into a past disruption story that we're all familiar with, or at least most of us listening are. The Nokia and Microsoft merger and eventual buyout. It was 2011. Microsoft was still recovering from all the Windows 7 backlash and just having released Windows Phone 7 as a separate operating system, and the Kinect was new and the Xbox 360 was new. And that's also when they partnered with Nokia. Oh yeah, and they just acquired Skype. There was a massive amount of criticism being hurled at Microsoft at that time for not being focused and acquiring companies and not integrating them into the core business and just not being focused. Do you remember that time? It was 2011, just 4 years after Apple changed everything with the release of the iPhone. Remember Vine? That app that killed the Microsoft phone? That app that wouldn't work on the Microsoft phone in 2013? Where's that app now? I think Twitter just shut it down a few months ago. Remember when we said we would never buy a $500 phone or a $1,000 phone? Remember when you got into someone's car and they were texting through their car interface? Yep, that was a Nokia phone. Remember wireless, or do they call it cordless, charging? Nokia was cutting edge. They had everything you thought a consumer would want. I and many other fans loved their hardware. And Microsoft partnering with them was a dream come true. The dream team that was going to take down Apple. But in reality, if you look at the numbers now, it was not good from the beginning. Sure, the hardware was amazing. That camera was amazing. Those pictures were amazing. Every time someone saw the pictures from any of our Nokia Lumia phones, they were just blown away that that was a cell phone or a smartphone. And they also had those icons that actually gave you information without having to click on them and open an app. Oh, and you could have more than one app open. It seemed like it was all cutting edge back then, and there's phones that still don't do some of those things. So Microsoft and Nokia partnered after Nokia had lost half of its phone market in the previous 12 months. Microsoft had lost even more than half of the market in the same time frame. They were hurting. They were both fighting against Apple. They needed to do something. Plus, they were fighting with Google. While that partnership did boost Microsoft numbers slightly over time and produce some of the best devices ever, Nokia never regained its dominance. Out of necessity, Microsoft made the choice to eventually buy the hardware and the services divisions of the company and retain control and stop Nokia from moving to Android or other options that were not Microsoft. Nokia had to do something. Microsoft did not want to lose their number one flagship hardware provider. Many have considered this the final nail in Ballmer's coffin that finally led to the succession by Satya. Now today, looking at the massive success that Satya has brought to the company and the focus on the business user, what would have happened if Satya had more influence earlier and Microsoft had set its sights on a company like BlackBerry instead of a Nokia? Makes more sense in hindsight to most people. We'll dissect that in a future episode. That's not for this episode. By the way, if you couldn't tell already, this is a bittersweet episode for me because out of all the phones I have ever owned, the Nokia Lumia series were my favorite. And many of the features in those phones are still more advanced than what we get today. It's very frustrating to me every time I see a new phone come out and go, oh yeah, I could do that 5 years ago, 7 years ago, whatever it was. So today we will focus on what did happen and we'll leave the what ifs for another time. But let's talk about what if you wanted to support this podcast. You're at home listening, you're in the car listening, you're at work listening, or maybe you're in the gym listening right now or running outside in the nice weather. What I would like is you to help me out by subscribing to the show, sharing it with your friends, sharing it with your coworkers. You can even share it with people you don't like. I won't hold that against you. So if you could take a minute, leave a review, that would be huge. These reviews are like cryptocurrency to podcasts. All right, so why did Microsoft partner with and then eventually buy the services and hardware divisions of Nokia? Why did it not work? What are the lessons of disruption and transformation that we can learn from this case study? We go to the head of operations for North America from 2011 to 2013 and see what we can learn.
Hi, I'm Nicki Purcell, Chief Digital Officer for the Dallas Morning News.
But before that, Nicki worked at Nokia.
So I was part of the North American leadership team that, ultimately is working through this transition prior to the purchase. So I actually left in June of 2013. So prior to Microsoft purchasing the handset division of Nokia, my work was trying to make the most of this new partnership and collaboration, evaluating how these two giant companies would start to work together against common goals, and identifying when we were successful at getting up to, 3/4 of the Microsoft ecosystem share, whether or not that was going to be enough to be viable for Nokia into the future, and what that meant for Microsoft. Ultimately, Microsoft had a choice to make. If they could not grow the ecosystem larger, they either needed to extend the runway, which made sense to purchase then the wireless division of Nokia, or they risked potentially Nokia saying, okay, we're going to open it up. We have to diversify our roadmap of products and start building on something like Android again. And so it was really an inflection point. And that was a lot of what my work was as part of the leadership team, was just evaluating all of the dynamics for which this business was going to go to. But my work preceded the acquisition. It was primarily evaluating the higher level strategy of how we would make this work.
So Microsoft's gross margin on the Lumia devices, the flagship devices, was $10. By purchasing Nokia, Microsoft could realize more than $40 per phone, a pretty significant jump in margin. Nokia made up more than 80% of all the Windows phones sold at that time. So if Microsoft wanted to capture the consumer mobile phone business, this appeared to be a step in the right direction. But before we get to that, in the inevitable merger and purchase of the hardware and services division of Nokia by Microsoft, let's take a step back and look at what the smartphone landscape looked like back then in 2011 and how Nokia fit in that market at the time.
Nokia had probably in the 30s in terms of market penetration, 30%. And it was a phone in the United States where pretty much anyone you knew, family members or friends, they carried a Nokia phone. You might remember the day back when they had faceplates and they were interchangeable. So if you were a huge Texas Longhorn football fan, you could wear that on your phone. So it was as much a fashion statement as it was a device that helped you connect. And that really was the phone that everyone carried. And what I would say is that the market dynamics changed. Consumer preferences changed. The next major evolution in mobile phone that came was the flip phone. So suddenly, everyone was carrying a flip phone, and usually they were silver, and they were also referred to as clamshells. And Nokia was late to that market. The next one you may remember was thin, so super ultra thin. In that case, I'd refer probably to the Motorola Razr as the super thin market or phone that set the benchmark in the market. Ultimately, after thin came touchscreen. Of course, most people now have an iPhone or an Android phone, and everything is done via touch. So, there were many evolutions from a product perspective along this path. And when I started, it was pre those continual evolutions and consumer preference changes that happened.
So that's a clear picture of what the hardware evolution looked like and the kind of landscape looked like back then. But what was the killer software or the killer app that Nokia had at that time?
When you think of app, I think of internet access. Today, an app is something you download from an ecosystem, right, that you use within your phone. And that was a really interesting change that we made in how we marketed these. It used to be, prior to smartphones coming along, that you bought a phone, and the day that you bought it was the beginning of its decay, the beginning of its ability to lose value over time. And with smartphones and apps and the ability to download apps and add to them, have them learn more over time, preferences, everything that we know now where it gets smarter and it helps us do things, we changed the positioning so that the day you bought that phone was actually the beginning of its lifetime value, and it only increased in value as you kept it. Now, sure, people still like to trade out and get different phones. They want the latest and greatest in terms of tech and spec features and that sort of thing. But whenever you ask someone how difficult it is to get a new phone, there's a little bit of a hurdle to get over. It's changing everything over. It's downloading new apps. It's making sure that everything that you had was stored now to the cloud and transferred over. And ultimately, it's because you've added your personal value to that device, and it simply is, hardware at this stage. But initially, it wasn't the case. The hardware was the device you were purchasing, and now it's so much more than that. So I wouldn't say there was a killer app. I would say there might have been killer features, and I think that was one of the challenges for Nokia, being in marketing and then moving into sales for them. One of the things that we recognized is we had dominant products. We had products that if you lined up next to any phone that was on the market, they were way better. We had wireless charging, and that's just now a feature that's come out on smartphones today.
I think I had the 900 or the 920, and I remember having that wireless plate.
Yes, a wireless charging plate.
I love
that's
that
right.
thing.
If you're watching TV today, you'll see commercials for wireless charging for the smartphones that they're selling in the holiday campaigns. That was 5+ years ago. And you think, wow, missed opportunity, right? We had integration with Bluetooth on cars in which the software in the phone was so much better that ultimately it's akin to what is today's Apple CarPlay. You could send and receive text messages via Bluetooth on your dash because of the software that was in the phone. And of course, we had Cortana, which was the version of Siri, or Alexa, as most of us use, or Google Home now, within the devices, which got smarter over time. So there have been lots and lots of features within the devices that oftentimes, in my opinion, didn't get their fair share of credit that were built into these Nokia phones, either because of the dominance of where they were in the market share and our ability to market them appropriately with the right amount of budget to break through.
So back then, Microsoft was criticized all the time for its disconnect in its marketing message. And a lot of people question why they bought companies and why they merged with companies and why they partnered with certain folks, because they never saw the reasons behind it or the outcome that they expected. So why would a company like Microsoft want to buy a company like Nokia?
There was a point in time where it was still Nokia before acquired by Microsoft, in which Nokia made the decision to go all in on the Windows ecosystem. And up until that point, the company was developing phones, producing phones that had multiple operating systems within them. You might have heard of Symbian, for example, which is an operating system. So the decision was made to go all in from an operating system platform into Windows. And in doing so, really narrowly focus the company, all of the resources around doing that, which was, in my opinion, really critical at a juncture where, in order to reach that number one state back in the United States market, focus was going to be something paramount to the success of that. Yeah, so Microsoft, up until the agreement with Nokia, was not building hardware for phones. They were building the software side of it, the actual ecosystem of Windows Phone, which ran similarly to Windows that you would have, in an operating system of your device. And that was one of the things that I think was beneficial in the partnership, is that the Nokia phone with the Microsoft software worked the best in terms of what you think of as your office software on a phone. Running an Excel spreadsheet, which might sound crazy to do on a 4 or 6 inch screen, was far better than it was, say, on an iPhone and something similar of that nature. But the partnership was one in which it was taking what would be best-in-class software on best-in-class hardware and being able to merge the two to bring the consumer, an unparalleled product that by far would be, the best thing that was in the market. Why would anyone select anything else?
Right. That's how I looked at it. That's why I had one. And in 2007, the iPhone came out, and they weren't doing anything that hadn't been done before. They were arguably a few years behind, but it was more of a design choice, and they captured the market through marketing. Your background is marketing. So how did that look to you from kind of the other side, as they're coming out with all this marketing and selling this arguably inferior product?
There's a difference between technology and lining up a device from a tech and spec feature and design. I mean, at the end of the day, people make a choice based on design. And at the time, Apple had really slick, sexy-looking devices, and people would line up to buy them. And the other thing that is really important is the user interface was really, really simple. It was so easy to get a brand new iPhone and be able to operate it that there was no real learning curve. You didn't have to be a Symbian user or a Windows Phone user for years to understand exactly all the tips and tricks.
I liked the Motorola. I liked the Nokia. I liked those devices because I could change the look and feel of it. I could do almost anything I wanted with it. They had a lot of kind of if and then apps where you can like kind of make your own app out of it. The widgets, still things that iPhone doesn't do, is there was like widgets on the screen that actually gave you weather and stuff. And I still miss that.
Yes. I miss People Hub today.
Yeah.
People Hub was the ability to go in and see in live updates what was happening with all the people that were in your circle without it being something that you had to go download in an app and personally connect to on a regular basis. It was a lot of content that came to you in a sort of push mechanism rather than you having to pull it, which is different than the ecosystems we live in today. So, there are fantastic things about those devices.
Okay, so we waxed nostalgic there a little bit, got a little bit off track, but getting back to the core question, how do you use marketing to get your phones that are arguably more advanced into consumers' hands?
It doesn't just come back to how well you market it. It's how much money you have to spend marketing it. And it's a very crowded space. It's not just about Apple. It's not just about Samsung, who would be a predominant player, certainly in the Android space. It's also about how much the carriers are spending in a market. Because by and large, most people go buy a device from a carrier store, a Sprint, AT&T, Verizon, et cetera. And in addition to Apple and Samsung having massive amounts of brand awareness spending in the market, the carriers are equally putting that much advertising dollars into the market. And so to be fundamentally successful at that, it really is a partnership game. It's combining the effort and the message and, quite frankly, the funds that you have to market a device with a dominant carrier, and the two of you going to market together, because only then will you start to have what I consider to be a significant campaign that can break through all of that noise.
Yeah, it seems very similar to like the VHS versus beta versus DVD. And, once Sony lost the first time, they spent arguably way too much money. It took them like 10 years to make that money back on going and buying all the licensed deals and the content and buying everything so nobody else could compete with them.
Right.
So it seems very similar where you can buy that space if you have enough money behind it.
That's right. And it's a classic case of a company that is, in decline and trying to reclaim its space, having to make very significant trade-offs in terms of expense budgets. And when you're trying to climb out of a hole, you have to be very strategic about the dollars that you spend and not at will start throwing money at things that may or may not yield the right return on investment.
So at what point did Nokia start losing that 30% market share that it had?
It was fairly early on, and that's why I went through the iterations of products that came out that I felt like Nokia perhaps was late to the market on. So whether it was the flip phone followed by a super thin phone or even touchscreen, all of those were sort of chinks in the armor that started to lead to the path. And I think one of the things fundamentally that when I reflect on it that we struggled with was, it's a European headquartered company. Where I sat in the organization was in North America. And our job was to be able to go back and influence what the R&D roadmap looked like. And so if we went back and we said, hey, we really need a flip phone, the feedback we might get back is, why? Just sell bars better. The candy bar. And, there are a couple ways to articulate something that you need. One may be to say, I need this because I can sell this many of them. The other might be, if I don't get this, this is what could happen to our market share. And a real sort of, learning for me in hindsight on that story was that when we were consistently crafting the story of needing flip phones followed by thin phones, and we'd say, no, we mean 7 millimeters thin. And they'd say, what? The battery is bigger than that. We'd say, that's right. That's why we're giving you like exact specs that we feel like we need to compete. What we needed likely to do is to craft a better story of what would happen if not. It's always great to give someone the positive perspective of where you could go if you could generate what you're asking for. But sometimes skinning that cat, just in a slightly different story, can also provide a motivation in a different way that might drive a different decision-making process there.
Okay, so when Microsoft got involved, they weren't doing the hardware themselves, and they were working with kind of a different hardware vendor for kind of everything. They had passed on an iPad-like thing at the beginning before they came out with Surface many years later. It seemed like they were really trying to figure out what they wanted to do. So Nokia has this market, is trying to, maintain that market, and it has this great device, has these great apps that are coming out, maybe late, but as Nokia starts losing ground and falling behind, and Microsoft are they getting more involved? What's going on? We're trying to get this market share. Did they feel like it was Nokia that was the problem, or was it more of a Microsoft Windows thing? I don't know where it was.
Okay, so I'll kind of take you back to the timing of when that entire partnership started.
Mm-hmm.
At first, Nokia was already in a place where the company was losing ground in terms of market share and consumer interest. At the time, Microsoft was just growing the ecosystem for Windows as it relates to phones. And so it became a natural partnership to say, look, Nokia is great at the hardware part. In fact, one of its strengths was in R&D. A statistic that I like to throw out there, because it's still mind-boggling to me, but is from a global supply chain perspective, Nokia was producing a phone every 11 seconds.
Wow.
So the strength of that kind of company that could produce that was a natural fit for a company who was just getting off the ground with a mobile device ecosystem that could say, wow, when we tie the two of these together, we're unstoppable. And it wasn't as though Microsoft had this huge ecosystem that was already great and they just said, hey, come join us. LG's got a product, so-and-so's got a product, just add to it. It was we have a few players who have committed to building on the Windows ecosystem, but it's only in its infancy. And if we tie that with this fantastic hardware together, we have the ability then to go compete with, Apple and Samsung on Android. And that was the partnership and the timing at which they were. They were single digits, low single digits, in terms of market penetration as an ecosystem for Windows Phone when the original partnership started. And so the goal was to grow that together. And there wasn't necessarily blame on either side. It was, how do we make these two giant companies begin to work together in a collaborative fashion with shared goals.
So we can look back on this story and we can get into, were the marketing dollars in the right place? Was the marketing message correct? We can even reflect back on the whole debacle that we didn't get into here about Vine, the killer app at the time on social media or for social media and on these phones, not even working on the Nokia phones or the Windows phones in general. It had nothing to do with Nokia. And Instagram not working. That was the big app of the day. There was a lot of back and forth where Google and Facebook and everybody involved were changing the APIs systematically on a weekly or even daily basis sometimes to really be a thorn in Microsoft's side and really make it difficult to deliver on their goals and to make this a great phone and a great marriage of hardware and software. So as we look back, what is the disruption story here? Who was disrupted and what can we learn from it?
Well, certainly, I think that there's a disruption story here. I also think that it's continual. I'm not entirely sure now where I could go back and articulate the changes in hardware from flip to, to thin to ultimately touch. Those were major milestones in the industry as things evolved. But now that we're living in a space where everything is connected, it feels as though the rapid rate of iteration is that we're in constant disruption. What I would take as certain lessons from this is that you have to be continually horizon watching. You have to ask yourself, what are the things that you can control? What can you expect to be able to influence? And then what are the things completely out of your control that you're maintaining an eye on? Because one of the things that we had was Windows had an ecosystem with phones prior to Nokia having this partnership. And we thought, why did they fail in the past? We even went so far as a North American leadership team to study them. We looked at what we consider to be successes, but also failed phone launches of the Windows ecosystem in the past.
Yeah.
And then we built a strategy to make sure we didn't repeat any of them. Mm-hmm. And it seemed like that would be almost foolproof. The strategy itself, The foundation was laid for it, and we looked at what to do as well as not what to do. But what we couldn't ever account for, and nobody really can, was what direction was the competitor going to go in, and what was ultimately consumer preference going to be. And when those two things are out of your control, you have to watch those and the trends so carefully so that you can react and pivot in such a way that you don't have to take, a massive amount of effort to change course and be able to react to it.
So from a consumer perspective, it seemed like, and I appreciate it as a consumer, is that the camera that was so advanced is so amazing.
That's right.
Even, what was it, the 1020? And that's still better than the cameras that are out today.
That's right.
And that phone, what was that, 6, 7 years ago? And it had that big bulb on the back, though, little down, little negative thing. But it was amazing. And I still have pictures from those phones, the 920, the 925, and the 910. And those pictures still stand up to the 7 Plus and the 8 Plus. So was part of that decision, okay, consumers will choose these features over the other device because we're so much further ahead than they are?
Well, I think that you also have to evaluate a classic case of a long tail in terms of adoption. So when you talk about that device and how it had such a great camera, I mean, it had Carl Zeiss optics in it.
Yeah.
We actually developed a phone, I think it was the 8800, that had ball bearings that were used in development for Porsche cars. I mean, the strength in manufacturing coming out of Nokia was one in which, in some cases, it required a higher price point. And when you're looking at what people will buy and where the average price of phones are, you have to be able to tell a story that the price that you're selecting for what this product is well worth the incremental cost than what mass adoption is. And I think it's a case of full breadth of portfolio. You have to offer enough devices where you can reach multiple price points, multiple consumer habits, et cetera. So just having a product that has the best phone camera at the time may be something to hang your hat on from a marketing perspective if you go all in on that particular device with that particular feature. But you have to make sure that the consumers are ready for it and that they're ready to afford that price point for it. Because think about what they were doing when they were taking these pictures. You might take an amazing megapixel photo back then, but at best, if you were posting it in social media, you didn't need it. You didn't need that quality. What you really needed that quality for was when you were going to take it and print it and zoom in and have the ability to do other things offline with it, and it wasn't the consumer behavior that was happening. I remember one year taking my family Christmas photo with the Nokia phone, partly because I knew the camera was amazing, and the other part was because I could say, I took this with a phone camera, and then the quality came out in a printed format so great that it was good enough for a Christmas card photo. It wasn't just the kind of phone camera you'd use to post to social media. There are broader uses to this. But let's face it, that's a smaller use case. It's not the norm. And so I think it's the balance between a killer app or a killer feature and mass adoption, and where the trade-off is with having enough that reach the mass adoption with the few in the niche place that might afford and, by the way, want that killer feature.
Yeah, it seemed like when they made that update where you get the bokeh effect in the background, nice blur, and then you could take great pictures at night in the dark. It was just, I'm like, that's killer. That's going to be it, right? There's no way anybody could argue with this. Right. And then a couple months later, the bokeh effect goes away, and they're not focused on it. It's just, that's not what the consumers wanted at that time.
And I also think that going back to the marketing spend, rightly so, I don't think there was as much marketing behind it. And so even though you, who might be a little bit further advanced in looking for those kind of tech features in your phone, the mass audience wasn't. And so the majority of them probably didn't know half of the features that I have already shared that I think were so much better than the market at the time. I remember people getting in my car, and I was having a conversation back and forth via text messaging, sending, receiving texts, and people said, how are you doing that?
Yeah.
And they wanted to buy my car. I said, it's not my car, it's the phone. And it wasn't something that we had the budget and could effectively market to compete with, as I mentioned, the noise of what the big giants were spending in terms of hundreds of millions of dollars for a campaign.
Okay, so as we start to wrap this up, so for anybody out there that's working at a company that's struggling or concerned about staying relevant in this current market, what are some final lessons or a final lesson that they can get from this story?
There was a group within Nokia that was a small group that was highly focused on what was coming next. I sort of refer to that as horizon watching. And I loved their mission statement. It was to surprise competitors. It was that simple. The whole goal was be aware of what's coming, make sure that we're staying ahead of it, and surprise competitors. And whether you're at Nokia that has that size of employee base or revenue, or a tiny company that is making sure that they're staying competitive, I would say it's always great to have a tiger team of people whose focus is to make sure that at least part of their dedication is keeping an eye on what's coming and focusing on how to surprise their competitors. Because as I mentioned, you can focus for sure on what is in your control, how you're going to market, how you're going to spend, what you're going to do from a future development perspective. But the thing you cannot control is what's happening in the environment around you. And if you've got a group that's focused on that, at least keeping their ear to the ground, I believe you can be far more successful at being part of the disruption rather than having it happen to you.
Yeah, it's better to be part of that disruption.
That's right.
All right, Nicki, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
There are a lot of lessons covered and a lot of points covered today. But one of the things that we talked about is you have to continually horizon watch and believe that you're in a constant state of disruption. So what are those things that you have control of? What are the things that you don't? And what are the ones that you are expected to be able to influence? And what do you need to be keeping your eye on? You need to be aware of what is coming. You need to have an infrastructure or a team, or everybody has to participate at some level of making sure that you're staying ahead of what consumers want and constantly being in a state of surprising your competitors. The other thing we also learned is you have to keep your eye on the trends. You have to be able to pivot. You have to have a model or an infrastructure or an organization that can move when react and change quickly when it needs to. And finally, you have to be able to tell a compelling story to the consumer that explains why you expect them to pay what you're asking them to pay, why you're adding additional costs, and what you're getting for that. And you need to have different price points, and you need to have different options for your customers if it makes sense. Why are they buying the best camera? Does my marketing line up to it? Does consumer behavior line up to it? Is it something they even want? So what is the balance between that killer app and mass adoption? Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. See you next week.
Words of mass destruction. Words of mass destruction.
I think that was good.
You think? I mean, that's
so
kind of the
sad.
direction
I'm
instead
like
of-
kind of depressed now.
Oh, sorry.
Because I love my phone so
Sorry.
much. My phone is so awesome.
What do you
I
carry
forget-
now?
I have the 7 Plus.
Okay, yeah.
And I do a lot of the videos for my daughter on the 7 Plus.